welcome you to today's program on the summer of 1787, The Men Who Invented the Constitution by David Stewart. For those of you unfamiliar with ACS, we're a national network of lawyers, law students, judges, and policymakers dedicated to ensuring that our nation's fundamental values of human dignity, individual rights and liberties, equality, and access to justice enjoy their rightful central place in American law and policy. First, ACS would like to thank Jenner and Block for hosting today's event. The story of the drafting of the Constitution is an incredibly important one, both to our national psyche and as a lesson in compromise and nation building. But the summer of 1787 also makes it a very engaging one. In this book, not only did I learn the etymology of the word gerrymander, but also that one of the framers of the Constitution and a future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or eventual Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was dismissed from Yale for, among other things, poisoning the communal bread, which I think makes today's law school experience and today's Chief Justices seem rather mild by comparison. On a more serious note, Mr. Stewart explores how we came to have the constitutional provisions that shaped our country at the founding, and most of which continue to do so today. He provides numerous insights on the compromises over slavery and their devastating effects, how we chose to structure power in our government, and perhaps most relevant for this year, why we have the Electoral College. You have full bios of the panelists. I'll briefly introduce our moderator to today's event, Paul Smith. He's an active trial and appellate lawyer here at Jenner and Block, and though there may be better days to mention this, has an active Supreme Court practice, having argued 12 cases before the Supreme Court with many notable victories, including Lawrence versus Texas. Paul also serves on the board of many organizations, and I'm very happy to say he is the chair of the board of directors for ACS. A few quick announcements before I turn it over to Paul. First, we'll have the book, The Summer of 1787, on sale out there, and feel free to purchase it after the program. I also would like to let you know both exits on both sides of the room work, so as you're exiting, if you're close to that door, please feel free to do so, unless, and of course, until you get your book.
But there's no
first.
book over there.
Yeah,
Don't want to go that way.
Actually, buy your book and then you can file back. Also, though we don't need the mics for amplification during Q&A, we will need them since we're recording the program, so please wait for a handheld mic if you have a question. And last but not least, please turn off your cell phones if you've not already done so. Paul?
Thank you, Mira. It's a real pleasure. It's great to see such a good turnout for this, and it's a real pleasure on my part to be able to have a conversation with an old friend, David Stewart. We've known each other longer than either of us probably wants to acknowledge, having been a year apart at Yale Law School some time ago. I'll let you both guess about who was a year ahead and who was a year behind, but. And then we clerked a year apart for Justice Powell a couple of years after that. So we've known each other quite a while, have shared a lot of experiences. David, after that, practiced law for a number of years at Miller Cassidy, and then more recently at Ropes and Gray, with a firm with which you continue to have an affiliation, although you try to do as little as possible, it sounds like, David, because you've become a great writer, a historian, and somebody who writes books that gather lots of people together to talk about them. Indeed, the summer of 1787 has, as Mira said, been very well received. The critics have been raving about it. As Booklist put it, David is a fine writer whose narrative unfolds like a well-structured novel. Or, to quote Anthony Lewis, David O. Stewart made clearer to me than ever the tensions and bargains that produced our Constitution at the Convention of 1787, especially the bargain over slavery with all its terrible lasting consequences. It's an irresistible drama. So to get things started, David, so I'll stop talking and you can start talking about the book. Let me ask the fairly obvious first question. Why did you think the world needed another book about the Constitutional Convention?
I've always thought that question should be asked of Simon & Schuster rather than me. Because I wanted to write one. It's a real disease among writers that you decide you want to write a book because you want to do it, and you're not thinking enough of the audience. And that is the publisher's job. I guess, the development of it was simply I had in a case I was working on, forced myself to read Madison's notes of the convention. And without Madison's notes, we couldn't do anything.
That was the
much.
impeachment case that you argued in the Supreme Court? Or?
It was actually a preemption case, a rather dreary,
less interesting,
run-of-the-mine preemption case. But the other side had quoted something that appeared to support them, which my associate told me was in fact the case, which annoyed me greatly. So he came in with the notes and said, "Here, you look." And so I took them home over the weekend and read them. And I was, we were able to work around that problem with the bad statement in the debates, but I was really knocked out by the debates. And I had read Catherine Drinker Bowen's book, Miracle of Philadelphia, which is sort of been the standard. We hope that'll be modified a bit. And had looked at some others. There are an amazing number of books about the convention once you start looking. I didn't know that John Dos Passos had done a book on the Constitutional Convention. And there were really three things I wanted to get across that I thought were different. One was the central role of slavery, which just knocked me out. I had not really understood that. I thought I knew a lot. I'd clerked at the Justice Powell and done a lot of constitutional cases and just didn't. I had evaded that truth, or it had not been presented to me. A second thing really was, when I read this stuff, it just seemed like such a political brawl. And I didn't feel like that had ever really been communicated to me in anything I'd read. I mean, these were really America's prime political horseflesh, all in one room, sort of fighting over who was going to have power. And they went at it. And a lot of the sort of theoretical stuff people do, and I respect because I'm not so interested in it, so I don't do it so much, seemed to me much less important than the politics, and I wanted to write about that.
And has it changed your sense of how you feel about the framers and their sort of status in our culture?
I don't think really. There is a marbleization of the framers, which we've achieved. I'm pretty sure most of the people in this room have been watching John Adams, and they did a decent job of making him, portraying him as sort of flawed as I think he probably was. And you can't read these debates without coming away thinking that, it was an amazing achievement, but boy, Madison really had a brain cramp on June 22nd or whenever he gave the speech saying that the upper house of the legislature should be devoted to the interests of slaveholders and the lower house should be devoted to the interest of everybody else. That was a very strange notion. And it was so weird that he then proposed it again 3 weeks later. I told him only to the dates, but he did it twice. So there were some odd episodes that you focus on. And that was actually the third thing I did want to focus on in the book was just the people. They're great characters. You can't do more than 6 or 8 or a dozen max. And frankly, there were some anonymous people there, which you can't do much with because we don't know much about them. There's a great thing, if you've been in the National Constitution Center up in Philadelphia, they've got this wonderful room with life-size sculptures of all the framers. And you can sort of walk around and see, gee, I was taller than Madison, or I'm a lot shorter than Washington, and all that sort of thing. But they also have this problem. There's one framer, I think it was Jacob Broom from Delaware. They don't know what he looked like. They don't know how big he was, how small he was. So that, he's sort of medium. But there were some people there who were just plain folks.
Was it your sense that most of the prior books that you looked at sort of contributed to this marbleization, this failure to treat these people as full-fledged people with all of their flaws and interesting foibles?
Yeah, I think that is a tendency. There was a book not too long ago by a professor named, I may get the name wrong, but Carol Birkin, where she did do some stuff with a couple of the personalities, but I thought not as much as might have been, as needed to be done. The title of Bowen's book, Miracle of Philadelphia, sort of tells you where we are. It's a miracle. And it was pretty great, but, I didn't feel like it was a miracle.
So presumably you went back and looked at all the original source materials you could. What is available to study this? Obviously Madison's notes, but...
Yeah, it was a great first book project because Ferrand's records of the convention, he's got Madison's notes and everybody else's notes. There was a fellow named Yates from New York who took notes for 6 weeks, and they're pretty good notes. And that's terrific because you can get a little comfort level that Madison's getting it right. And the same people talk about the same subjects on the same day in both sets of notes, which is really nice. A few other people took notes for like a day and then got bored. It was hard to do, apparently. And then what Ferrand did, and his set comes from 1911, was collected everything else, all the correspondence, all the news stories. There were very few news stories. Of course, they met in secret. But the follow-on, there were some pieces done in the press by some of the delegates, all the way through to his time. So it's a tremendous collection. And then there's a fellow up at the Library of Congress named James Hudson who did a 4th volume, came out about 15 years ago, with things that had turned up between 1911 and 1990. So probably, well over half of my research was in those 4 volumes, which was
not
great.
the usual way for a historian.
No.
Well, tell us a few things about some of the individuals. Maybe, obviously, there's a few people everybody thinks of when you think about the framers: Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Washington. Maybe sort of which people are less well known, played a huge role in the process.
Well, I was particularly impressed with, several, I have to admit, but 2 in particular. Maybe they'll say 3. I'm trying to talk fast. Who
You
don't
talk fast anyway, Dave.
Yeah, good. Who don't get much credit. One, just because he's so engaging, is Gouverneur Morris, who was a fellow in his mid-30s, a big strapping guy. He had a peg leg he lost a leg in an accident. Quite a ladies' man. Everybody wanted to think that the accident had been flight from a jealous husband, but the official story is it wasn't. Although John Jay wrote about it that way, which was a whole new way to think about John Jay. And he spoke more often than anybody else at the convention. He was a bit of a gadfly, but he gave a wonderful speech about slavery. It was the subject everybody danced around for a couple of months, and he really gave this oration that can still send chills down my spine. And Madison wrote it down, which I got to give Madison credit for doing that, as a slaveholder, where he called slavery the curse of heaven that would curse this nation forever. And the motion he made was supported by 1 other delegate out of the 35 or 40 who were there that day.
Abolition?
It was to abolish the slave trade. But I think he very much changed the dynamic of the convention, and they did end up restricting the slave trade. Not as much as they should have, no doubt, but it was a different time. He also wrote the final draft of the Constitution, which I'm so frustrated he doesn't get more credit for this. I mean, there are other things in my life that are more frustrating, but, we deify Jefferson for the Declaration, which is a good job, but it's a rant. I mean, it's not that hard, And with Morris, he had to take all this goo. I mean, they had all these amendments and modifications and motions, and it was tough stuff, like eating steel wool, and make it into the Constitution, which it's not perfect. There are some passages that you really could sharpen up, but he did it in 2 days.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Pretty good job.
Because it wasn't like he was just sort of editing here and there. He reorganized it completely, dropped whole passages.
There were 23 articles. He made it 7. Yeah. I mean, he really did an amazing job.
And he was using a quill pen, presumably, too.
He did not have, cut and paste and all those things that we do. Just quickly, James Wilson of Pennsylvania was, I think, probably the best lawyer in the room. He was, his client was the King of France. It's got to have been a good client in those days. And was a terrific thinker and came up with a couple of the critical compromises. He thought up the Electoral College, which is a mixed bag, but it got them over a hard spot. And John Rutledge of South Carolina, which if you've fought your way through the book, I end up really acknowledging him as the closest thing I think of as the father of the Constitution. It was sort of hard to come to that view because he was ardent defender of slavery. But by the measures that I found myself applying, did the debate change after he spoke? Yeah, the debate changed after he spoke. Who served on the committees? Most of the tough issues were resolved in the committees. Well, he served on most of the committees. He was on 5. Who chaired the committees? He chaired 3, and he chaired the big one that produced the first draft of the Constitution. And they did amazing things in that committee. So it was sort of kicking and screaming, but I ended up concluding that he was a powerful force there and a much neglected character in history.
One of the things you find out at the end, of course, is that at least 2 of the people you just mentioned, Wilson and Rutledge, kind of disappear from the history books because their lives didn't go so well after the convention. So you might want to fill us in about that.
Yeah, they embarrassed their peer group a lot. And so really for about 100 years, nobody wrote anything about them because they ended so badly. Wilson was a crazed, I'm not coming up with the word, he was greedy. He wanted to be rich, so he got involved in terrific land speculation schemes, got way overcommitted, and ended up on the lam from the law. He was imprisoned. He was a Supreme Court justice. He was imprisoned for a while for debt, and then he went on the lam again. There were 4 states in which he couldn't sit, and he finally was confined in North Carolina, in Edenton, North Carolina. They made a deal with the court. And it was really poignant because his creditor was another delegate, Pierce Butler from South Carolina, but it was $200,000, which was a lot of money in those days. And he stayed at, I think it was the Hornblow Tavern. He had to stay there until they paid off the debt, which he would never be able to pay off. And he was there for 4 months until he finally had a stroke and died. He got malaria. So a Supreme Court justice on the lam, it just was embarrassing. And Rutledge,
It's even worse.
whom but actually I find a little more human. He had a bad go. It was about a 6-week period when his wife and mother died, and he clearly went into a depression. This is in the early 1790s, and it's not clear he came out of it. He was sitting as Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court at the time, and was appointed to be Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1795 by Madison. By Washington, which was an amazing thing. The vacancy came up because Jay resigned, and Rutledge wrote a letter saying, "I'd like to be Chief Justice," sent it to Washington, and Washington by return mail said fine, and appointed him. Because he respected him so much from his performance at the convention. But there was a lot of word out that Rutledge was crazy, and so he didn't get confirmed. He also had opposed the Jay Treaty in a vitriolic and stupid way, which had killed his chances. So he was the first Supreme Court justice defeated for confirmation. And right at that time, he walked into the Ashley River and tried to drown himself and was pulled out, ironically enough, by slaves. So he embarrassed everybody, too. So Wilson and Rutledge have done poorly. You won't find good biographies of either.
Well, how about people whose role, sort of looking back, has been inflated instead of being obscured? I mean, one gets a strong sense that Alexander Hamilton's role was really inflated by what he did later on, or not so much what he did during the convention.
Yeah, that's fair. The Federalist Papers are terrific, and his stuff in the Federalist Papers is amazing. But at the convention, he was really a bust. Part of it was his delegation. The New York delegation was totally dysfunctional, which New York politics were totally dysfunctional. It was sort of a tribal. You had the Livingstons and the Schuylers and the Clintons, and they produced this delegation with, you had to have at least 2 delegates present. There were only 3 delegates. And the other 2 delegates hated Hamilton. And after 6 weeks, they left. So he was there by himself, not even part of an official delegation. So he left, ultimately. And he was not there for most of the convention. Well, more than half of the convention he was away. He gave a disastrous speech, 5-hour speech. We will not take that long. In which he espoused a life term for the president. He basically espoused the abolition of the states. It really was not a politically apt speech.
It was basically a monarchy he was talking about. It was
yeah,
pretty close.
Yeah, life term for the senators. just was in an argument with a professor who insists that it was, and there is this viewpoint that it was strategic, that Hamilton, by being an outlier, was making the aggressive nationalist program more attractive, which I just don't see. That sort of self-immolation for the cause just doesn't seem plausible. So when the Constitution is signed, actually Washington ends up writing in his diary the Constitution was signed by 11 states and Colonel Hamilton, which was the case, because he was not part of the state delegation. The other guy, and I have mixed feelings about him because he's a wonderful historical figure, but Madison, I think, has really done awfully well. And it's a great instruction in the power of getting control of the paper, because he had control of the paper. And he was also smart enough to outlive all the other delegates. So anytime somebody wrote something that he didn't like, he would immediately denounce him in some piece of correspondence. I did not feel that Madison changed debate when he talked. I did not feel he wasn't on committees. The Virginia plan doesn't look much at all like the Constitution looks.
And that was the plan they proposed at the very beginning.
Yes, and he did produce that. I think he was I might call him the father of the convention, but I think he was pivotal in getting the convention called. The Constitution itself, I think he was very important for, but I wouldn't call him the father.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about this slavery issue some more, and how it is striking in the way you present it, and it rings true when you read it, that it was just a constant theme coming up in the debates. I have confidence in you, David, that you know, in a convention really forming the structure of a government with 3 branches and everything, that somehow this one issue would keep coming up in all kinds of interesting and complicated ways.
Yeah, that is the striking thing for me. They didn't go to Philadelphia to do anything about slavery. You know, it was legal in 12 of the states. Only Massachusetts made it illegal, and that was by a court decision. And whenever they started talking about democratic structures, it sort of turned out that they had these 600,000 people. There were only a little less than 4 million people in the country, but 600,000 of them were in chains. So what do you do with them? How do you count them? And that was the first issue that came up, which was big fight over would the legislature be by state representation, which is what they'd always done. And at the convention, each state had 1 vote. So Delaware and Pennsylvania had the same power, which drove the Pennsylvanians wild. And also was somewhat contrary to democratic theory. So they wanted very much to change that. And that's when the issue of the slaves came up. And the Southerners had this weird formulation of quotas of contribution. That's how we should allocate congressmen. And I could never quite tell what they're talking about, and I don't think they were too sure, but the notion was that wealth should play a role, which was clearly a surrogate term for slaves. And Wilson and Rutledge, my 2 candidates for the least liked but most influential delegates, made this deal. Which was awful, the 3/5 rule.
And that was really about sort of
count the slaves as 3/5.
The large states deciding they would make an alliance with the slave states and get what they wanted, which was popular representation, at least in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, the large states had a problem that there were only 3 of them, and they were voting by state. So they had to make a deal with somebody, and it was the logical deal to make. I speak only as a narrator here, not as a commentator, and that was the only way there were certain small states they could never deal with, and the Southerners had this interest that they really were eager to protect, or desperate to protect.
So how does this play out? The issue comes up as they're trying to figure out how to set up Congress, which sounds like it took about half a convention or more.
It is how it came up, and it ultimately ended in the first committee of the convention. If we all remember from grade school, the Virginia plan was first proposed, and then the small states come in with the New Jersey plan, which really was very little change from what they had. And they just got snarled up on it for about 5 weeks, and ultimately they did set up their first committee, and this is when they realized that a room this size, this many people, was a lousy way to resolve a tough issue. And so they had 1 delegate from each state, And they sat for one long day, and finally, great timing, Ben Franklin proposed this compromise, which also involved letting there be per-state representation in the Senate. Because when they made the deal for the 3/5 rule, they actually had proportional representation in both houses of Congress. And that prevailed for several weeks. And the small states were not letting anything happen, anything go forward. So ultimately, although that deal was rejected, Franklin's proposal, ultimately it was accepted.
One of the striking things is that they had this rule that you could reconsider anything an infinite number of times, so the debates would just never quite get resolved.
It was grim. It's like negotiating with somebody who just says, let's go back to Section 1 here.
You have this image of these people sitting there in their wool suits at 100 degrees all summer in Philadelphia, reconsidering things over and over again.
They got short-tempered. And the last couple of weeks, it's impressive. There are subjects that would have taken them days that they do in an hour. I mean, they're, and that's also human experience. But, after a while, they got a lot faster at getting these things done. Also, I have to confess, a few of the people who were real obstructions had peeled off by then.
Yes. How was it that they ended up giving the Senate the state-by-state representation if there was this alliance between the large states and the slave states that was sort of had fought that off for a while?
Oh, this is embarrassing. We don't have a good explanation.
That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, there was a key vote, and it was a Georgia delegate. The Georgia delegation was in tatters. Two of them, they had 4 delegates. 2 of them had gone off to sit with Congress in New York. Congress was meeting at the same time. It was sort of the second string framers were up there. And so there were only 2 Georgia, and Georgia had been voting 4-0 as part of this deal. So they were down to 2, and this one guy, Abraham Baldwin, flipped. And he was not really a Georgian, which may be the key. He was from Connecticut, had only moved down there 3 years before, and of all things, had a Yale education. But he never really explained himself. He was a senator in the new government and never explained himself. And there was a second key vote several days later, which we know even less about, when the North Carolina delegation flipped. And I don't talk about it much because there's no explanation. Because by then the Georgia delegation was back and had come around, but they still fell apart. And the Massachusetts delegation deadlocked. Clearly, something was going on. It was horse trading of the first order, but it was supposed to be secret. They didn't. Many of them did not keep notes, and there are still secrets. We don't know.
One of the things that's striking is we're so used to the Senate being kind of big states and little states get equal representation. There were obviously a lot of people in that room who thought this was just an awful idea, that it would basically undermine the basic democratic principles of the country and just produce terrible outcomes, and then they were quite adamant about it for a long time.
Wilson and Madison essentially presented unanswerable arguments that it was anti-democratic. There was a strong view that it would be aristocratic, which is slightly puzzling for me when I read the arguments, but I think they were actually responding to what the sponsors of the Senate really wanted, which was an aristocratic body. That there's this wonderful anecdote I don't use, but when Jefferson asked about the Senate, was drinking tea, and somebody asked him, what's the point of it? And he said, well, you pour a little of the hot tea into your saucer, and it cools, and then you can drink that, and that's the Senate. I mean, it will allow a cooling off of emotions, and the House was to be the popular body that would be passionate. So there was this view that as an aristocratic body, the Senate was a terrible idea, and the 3 delegates who stayed all summer and refused to sign objected to the Senate particularly. You look at it today, 18% of the population can muster a majority in the Senate.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty weird.
And as originally conceived, of course, the Senate wasn't even popularly elected, even
Right.
on a gerrymandered basis. It was state legislatures were
Yes.
sending the people off. So one of the 3/5 thing, we probably have one more mention of that. One of the things you talk about in the book is what the actual effects of that were. I mean, obviously it's a terrible thing in principle. It's a great sort of stain on the Constitution that they treated people as three-fifths people. But it actually had a huge effect on the emerging republic over the next few decades in terms of how the representation was handed out in the country, right?
It certainly did. The best example is the election of 1800, which John Adams would have won, but for the three-fifths rule. Now, I have gotten the pushback that, well, what if you counted the slaves for 100%, which was one of the options that was argued about. But by counting them as 60%, that meant that the southern states had enough electoral votes to put Jefferson in office. And of course, that was a huge turning point in the nation, brought the end of the Federalist Party. But until the Civil War, you probably had 2 to 3 dozen additional congressmen from the South because of the three-fifths rule. 10 of our first 15 presidents were slaveholders. And frankly, the Northerners who were elected president who were not slaveholders were effectively slaveholders. People like Buchanan and Franklin Pierce, they were so tied to Southern interests that it was not like having somebody else as president. And it, you know, any time, and we had these crises with the various compromises of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all terrifically influenced by the fact that the South had these additional congressmen.
Well, there's an interesting divide in the convention between the Virginians, who were, I guess, all slaveholders, but all felt really, really badly about it, and the South Carolinians, who I would say were a little bit more focused on the economics of the situation and less apologetic about it. What would you say?
Yeah, the Virginians are slightly nauseating because they write to each other, you know, oh, this is terrible, if only I could, you know, not have this moral burden. And, you know, there actually were ways out, which is very flip and glib for me to say, but there were. And, you know, there were men at that convention who had freed their slaves. William Livingston of New Jersey had freed his slaves. He only had 2. It wasn't a huge gesture, but it was good. John Dickinson of Delaware had 57 slaves, and he had freed his slaves just a couple of years before. So it wasn't impossible. You could do it. These were rich people. And the South Carolinians were cold about it, frankly. They just thought it was an economic necessity for them.
But they also, I think, suspected the Virginians, I gather, because they thought Virginians were all the huge preponderance of most of the current slaves were. So if the slave trade got cut off, Virginians would be in this great position to sort of sell off people for the rest, for the future.
There was a real tension within the Southern group over that. Virginia was expected to be a net exporter of slaves within the country, and if you cut off the slave trade, then that would benefit the Virginians and drive up the price of their product.
Well, talk about we've done Article 1. How about Article 2, the presidency, which seems to have been kind of a last-minute, not very well done piece of the whole architecture?
Well, when you read the Constitution, Article 1's a lot longer than Article 2. They didn't have so much time on it to deal with it. They had a lot of trouble with it. There are different explanations for that. They had a terrible time figuring out how to elect the president, and they finally came up with the Electoral College, which is a very odd arrangement. But they had much odder arrangements before them. My favorite was one from James Wilson, where he had proposed that all the congressmen, they were very concerned that if you had Congress elect the president, which was something they looked at very hard, that congressmen would be bribed. I know it's hard to imagine, but that was their fear. And so Wilson came up with this notion that you get all the congressmen together, and they would all draw lots. And the 15 congressmen who got the short straw, you'd hustle them into a committee room, lock the door, and they'd pick the president before anybody could bribe them. And you couldn't pay off all the congressmen, so this would, and that actually got another vote, but only 2. Madison thought that the presidency suffered from a lack of time, that they were hurried when they got to it, and he wrote that afterwards. Others suggested, and I do think this is probably true, if they were going to cut a corner, that was a fairly easy place to do it because they knew Washington was going to be president. They trusted Washington. And it was even maybe a little awkward to talk about restricting the president with him in the room. And, you know, they didn't think this Constitution would last more than maybe 40 or 50 years at the outside. So I genuinely think they just decided to sort of hustle through it at the final moment. A fascinating thing is, I don't write much about this, but there was a lot of debate over whether to have a executive council, something like the cabinet, but some official board of advisors for the president, which some of the states had for their governor, and they just could never agree on it. And so they finally just threw it out and just, well, the heck with it. And, we'll let Washington figure this out.
So play out a little bit. I take it this is one of the things you think they could have done a better job on. What exactly was wrong with Article 2, at least it was originally conceived in terms of the selection process?
Well, the selection process was a disaster because they didn't have a distinction between president and vice president. They didn't actually think of vice president until the last week of the convention, or 2 weeks. So it got incompletely integrated. And so they had this system where the electors would vote for 2 candidates. And whoever got the most would be president, and whoever got the second would be vice president. So immediately Hamilton, our Machiavellian genius, started trying to fool with the system when we had elections. So he tried to make sure that Adams would come in second to Washington, first in the 1788 election, then in 1796. He tried to get Thomas Pinckney somehow elected over Adams by having some electors Federalist electors withhold their votes from Adams and vote only for Pinckney. Instead, it backfired on him, and the New England delegates withheld their votes from Pinckney. And that's why Jefferson became Adams' vice president, which was very weird to have your opponent as your vice president. And then in 1800, of course, we had the deadlock with Jefferson and Burr, again because there was no distinction between president and vice president. So that was fixed in the 12th Amendment. But we still have this somewhat wacky electoral college, which predictably will give us minority presidents.
It was striking, though, that they seemed to, at least for parts of the time, to be anticipating that most presidential elections would get thrown into the House of Representatives, that would be the norm, and that the Electoral College most often wouldn't be able to reach a majority for one candidate.
Well, that's right. George Mason said he thought 19 out of 20 elections would be decided by Congress, which is the final.
Initially it was going to be the Senate, I guess, and then
they moved it.
Yeah.
But they thought, frankly, that the people were ill-informed and not really to be trusted, and would not know the potential presidents the way they should know them. And they did trust themselves and people like them, and that's really what they were trying to set up.
And they really didn't anticipate the emergence of parties. I mean, the idea that there would be 2 leading candidates, each with a huge apparatus, just didn't occur to them, even though it occurred within 5 or 6 years after the Constitution was ratified.
It did come around pretty quickly, and several had been educated in England, several were immigrants from the Great Britain, and they certainly had to know that there were parties in Great Britain and that there were parties in ancient Greece, and that parties happen. It's one of the ways you manage and contend for power. So I think it was partly a value judgment. They disliked parties in principle. They didn't really have too many parties at the time. Most of the tensions nationwide were sectional between parts of the country rather than sort of philosophical between parties. So I think it was a sort of wishful thinking.
You mentioned that having President Washington in the room, future President Washington in the room, sort of affected the debate, and it also made it perhaps them less a little concerned about the process because they knew at least who the first 8 years are going to be, or however many years it might work out to be. Tell us a little bit about the role that Washington actually played as a framer. I mean, he sounds like he sort of sat there and looked self-important the whole time, but didn't actually say very much.
Well, he said he spoke twice. He spoke on the first day to thank them for making him president, and he spoke on the last day to make this rather innocuous motion to shrink the size of congressional districts, which had failed a few days before, but once Washington said he wanted it, everybody just said fine, and they just voted by acclamation. They didn't even have a roll call. And it is a fascinating exercise of leadership. I think without him there would not have been a Constitution. I think he was the one, it's just as trite as you can be, but he was the indispensable man there. He was the name Americans wanted to see on that Constitution. And it was a remarkable act of trust by him. These squabbling, ill-tempered overheated people, he basically said to them, look, whatever you come up with, I'll make the best of.
It doesn't sound like he was a very good moderator, at least in one sense, because you get the idea that they're sitting there and these people in a room smaller than this with a much smaller number than the people that we have here, were making these long-winded speeches at each other for hours on end.
Yeah, this is the era before sound bites.
Well, I suppose that's true.
Oratory was a tradition, and it was spectator sport. And, you know, it's hard to contemplate a 5-hour speech, but I've heard, I'm changing the subject a lot here, but I have heard from people who sat through Fidel Castro ranting for 5 or 6 hours that he was fabulous. I mean, it's a performance thing. So, you know, I think they put a lot more into it than we imagine. Although there was one guy, apparently, who used to be able to empty the hall, this fellow Luther Martin from Maryland.
Tell us about him.
He
was a popular guy.
I loved him just because he was so human. And I focused on the Maryland delegation. I'm from Maryland. You know, nobody's ever written about him, and it turns out nobody's written about him because they were such a second-rate group of unimpressive people. But Martin was the most impressive, and he was this guy who apparently showed up drunk on occasion, tended not to wash regularly, and was very, very smart and a very fine lawyer. And he would give these long speeches and just empty the hall if people did not want to hear it. And there's this, it's early in the convention, and it's one of the moments when you have two note takers, both Madison and this fellow Yates from New York, which is wonderful because at the end of this long speech, and they both note that Martin spoke for 3 hours, and you've only got like, I don't know, half a page. And the fellow from New York, Yates, says, I would write more except I could not make any more sense of it. So Martin was a trial.
You mentioned the president's, Washington's leadership. Were you referring primarily to the fact that by putting his name on the Constitution, he got it ratified, or was it more about keeping the group together in the room?
Yes, I think it's both.
I mean, how realistic do you think was the threat that the thing would just fall apart through that whole 5 or 6 month period? There was an awful lot of threats to walk out. But
you know, I'm always uncomfortable with the what-if game. It does seem to me that you had a substantial segment of people who had to be there. I came away stunned that the small states were able to get the concessions they got because where were they going to go? I mean, they were small states. I mean, they were really stuck. It wasn't like Delaware was going to have an alliance with France, although the guy did actually threaten something like that, which was one of the ugliest moments of the convention. I think it was not impossible, but you know, they'd gone to a lot of trouble to get there. I think it was more plausible that they would produce something that didn't get ratified. I think that could have happened.
One of the things that occupied a fair amount of time was the idea of what was going to happen west of the 13 colonies. Why don't you talk a little bit about how that became an issue?
Well, there was a certain amount of pull up the ladder behind us, which mostly came from New England. And there's a wonderful motion when a couple of the New England guys proposed, Massachusetts guys proposed that a provision that would provide that for the rest of time in the United States, the 13 original states would always have a majority of Congress, which only lost by 6-4, and you know, was obviously would have been created a lot of strain with the settlers. There was already tremendous migration out over the Appalachian Mountains, so it was not. It would have been a terrible misstep.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a lot of concern about those settlers and whether they were going to really stay a part of the country, as opposed to going off and making alliances of their own.
That had been an anxiety, and it was one of the moving forces, frankly, that you would have 4 different countries. You would have New England, the Middle States, the South, and the West. The Westerners, several of groups had been playing footsie with the Spanish. Andrew Jackson was actually part of one group that had entered into negotiations with the Spanish. There was a tremendous distance. I mean, it was physical, it was psychic, it was really everything between the seaboard and the settlers on the other side of the mountains. And on all their trade had to go down the Mississippi, so they just were not facing in their minds the East. So it was a serious issue.
You get the sense that the framers, in part, looked down on the Westerners, but even on the people in their own state. For example, in Massachusetts, there was this great divide between the framers from Boston and these sort of Western New England farmers that had started the little Shays Rebellion that kind of triggered the whole sense that we really need to get a good government going here.
Well, you have that, you know, we're, I don't know, caste people, and we're caste creatures. You certainly had that in the South, where you'd have the huge landowners along the coastal areas, tidewater area of Virginia, as opposed to the more independent farm population farther inland. And there were struggles within those. And actually, this is the point I had intended to make earlier. Was an interesting problem in the South with that divide was the 3/5 rule was adopted by many state legislatures, which meant in the South you ended up empowering the slave owners against the non-slave owners within each state. So it actually had a very pernicious impact throughout the political structure.
Interesting. Now, how did they get through this whole process and not spend any time talking about individual rights?
They just weren't thinking about it. It comes up in the last week. The two of the guys who are not going to sign, and everybody knows they won't sign, Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts and George Mason from Virginia, do this sort of double team where one of them stands up and says, "There's no Bill of Rights here. If there were a Bill of Rights, someone were to propose that, I would second it." So the other guy gets up and says, "I propose a Bill of Rights." And the first guy gets up and says, "I second it." And we think, in fact, they had one in their pockets, that Luther Martin of Maryland, my favorite drunken delegate, had actually written one. And it wasn't that hard. A lot of the states had guarantees of rights. And they got shouted down, and by people who knew better. I mean, James Wilson, who wrote the Supremacy Clause, actually said, well, you don't have to worry about it. Your state rights will persevere. The federal government will be in no position to harm you. And within weeks after the Constitution was promulgated, they realized that that had been a clean mess. And
but was it true in part that they really thought that the federal government was so limited to these specific powers that there wasn't really a need to sort of create a bunch of rights up against them? That for example, didn't one of them say that, don't worry about the press, regulation of the press isn't even within the powers of the federal government?
And, you know, it's hard to know, are they being disingenuous in making that argument, or do they really think that's the case? I have to tell you, I think it was a little of both, and, you know, they wanted to go home. And, you know, I don't think, and I guess I think within just a few weeks after the Constitution was released, they were singing a different tune, and that reinforces my notion, my suspicion that they were being a bit disingenuous.
Fair enough. But it was basically, was there a deal cut? I wasn't so clear on this. That basically, when they put it out for ratification, were they sort of promising to these various states that they would, in fact, put these amendments out? Yeah,
people like Madison and Wilson made statements saying that, of course, there will be a Bill of Rights adopted. That'll be the first thing we do, and it was one of the first things they did. So it was part of the ratification debate.
When did the draft of that start circulating? Was that?
Many of the states ratified with proposed rights. Mm-hmm. I think North Carolina sent in 26, although North Carolina was late, so they probably shouldn't count for much. They actually didn't ratify until after Washington took the oath. But I think 6 or 7 states actually sent in lists of rights when they ratified that should be adopted. So those were in circulation very early.
And what was the deal with Rhode Island?
They
never showed up, right?
Yeah, no, they never came. It's mostly attributed to currency. They had their own state currency, which was a huge problem at the time. We haven't talked about it, and I won't. But one of the things they knew the convention was going to do was prohibit state currencies. The leading framers were unmistakable on that subject. They thought, we had 10 or 12 forms of currency in the country, and it was a mess. And Rhode Island didn't want to lose its currency. It also was a very populist government at that time, and this was seen as a more aristocratic move for centralization of power. So Rhode Island actually did not ratify until 1791. Washington had been president for 2.5 years.
You mentioned that George Mason and Gary decided they weren't going to end up signing it. Randolph as well from Virginia,
Yes.
right? What was George Mason, at least in Virginia, is now remembered as one of the great framers. What was his objection, and was there is there a way to articulate what it was that he ended up disliking about the Constitution?
Well, he had a big laundry list, about a dozen things, and it was the Bill of Rights, it was the Senate. But to be honest, and it's a bizarre thing to get your brain around, it seems to have been the navigation laws. It was the final deal over the slave trade, was they had a 2/3 vote requirement for Congress to adopt commercial laws, what they called them navigation laws. And he, that was ultimately traded away in order to get 20 years of the slave trade. That went down to a pure majority on the navigation laws. And that stuck in Mason's craw, which was bizarre because he had given an incredibly impassioned speech denouncing the slave trade. So it was very difficult to put it together. Madison actually wrote Washington a somewhat sneering letter, but basically saying, well, you know, Mr. Mason got tired and cranky.
You start the book with Mason having a drink with Washington at Mount Vernon, sort of the beginning of talking about forming the convention. By the end of the process, I take it they weren't so good friends?
No, and Washington, who had a tremendous talent for cutting off people he didn't like anymore, really cut Mason off at the knees, and wouldn't have anything to do with him. Mason opposed ratification in the Virginia Convention. He stuck by his
Patrick
guns.
Henry,
Yeah, but you know, Washington would have nothing to do with him after that.
And then Madison later on got cut off as well, I take it?
Well, he sort of cut himself off. I've actually been reading the Ellis book, Joseph Ellis book about Washington, and he does end up cut off from a lot of the people he was in politics with. But Jefferson and Madison both sort of turned on him. Right. And I don't actually blame Washington for that one. They did turn on him.
One question, maybe we'll open up for questions after that. Did you see much in the debates about anticipation of the whole concept of judicial review? I mean, was that something that Chief Justice Marshall pretty much could be credited with having invented later on?
It's a great question because it's so difficult to find. There were a couple of debates, days, when people gave speeches denouncing judicial review, and nobody supported it. And the people who denounced it were John Dickinson of Delaware and John Francis Mercer of Maryland, who was another one of the anonymous mediocrities from Maryland. And it's weird because they're sort of fighting against an opponent that doesn't show up. Nobody gets up to say, well, no, judicial review's right. And I think it was, you know, here I'm lapsing into conspiracy talk, I think it actually was a sort of a tacit agreement within the delegates that they actually couldn't say judicial review, that might tick off people who seemed sort of aristocratic and non-democratic. But they did want it. Many of the states had judicial review at the time, and their state Supreme Courts would strike down statutes as unconstitutional. So it was understood. And I think that really was what happened there. And then Marshall, I think, was being true to the intent. And Justice Scalia would have my head for this and many other things. It's not articulated.
All right, now you made me ask one more question. Did it change your perspective, this whole study, did it change your perspective on the sort of notion that there can be a kind of an originalist approach to interpreting the Constitution to have read through the debates?
Yeah, it reinforced my view, which is, of course, what we all do as we get older. Our views only get stronger. But it did reinforce my view that I don't understand the originalists. You know, if it's clear in the Constitution, we follow it, and if it's not clear, we've got to figure out what they meant and how it works. And it's not easy. And this notion that somehow it comes to you, and I saw Justice Scalia on 60 Minutes last night, which is why it's sort of on my mind, I just don't get it. And you know, they were very vague about quite a few things because they couldn't agree. So this notion that we can, you know, just slavishly follow what's there.
I mean, basically, there's a lot of just gaps that they said, well, let somebody figure that out later on.
Judicial review.
Yeah.
Intentionally. So, or is there a cabinet? That's not in the Constitution. Should we get rid of it?
I'd love to open up the conversation. Please do grab a microphone before you participate. And we have 2 microphones around here, so I guess I'll call on people. How about you, sir? There's one coming over here.
I'm Dane von Breitenbroek with the U.S. Bill of Rights Foundation. 2 quick questions. You started off by saying there were 4 reasons why you wrote the book, and you covered 2, and I think you kind of dropped off, and maybe it was subsumed in what you had to say later. You said this central role of slavery and the political brawl over power, and then I didn't hear the other 2. And my other question is, you said, while speaking, that they were only expecting this Constitution to last about 50-some years. What were they anticipating that they would do? Would they have another Continental Congress and write another one, or what?
I only meant to say there were 3 reasons I wrote the book, and the third was going to be to talk about the people and what difference individuals made, and to give us a better sense of what the people were like who were at the convention. I don't think they worried much what was going to happen 50 years from then. There was George Mason and Elbridge Gerry were arguing in favor of another constitutional convention right away. Their notion was, well, we'll put out this Constitution as a draft, and then we'll have a new convention to work over the draft again, which everybody else thought was the equivalent of brain surgery. They just didn't want to go through it. So I think they would have been fine with another convention or something else.
They didn't actually invent the concept of amendments other than through a convention until very late in the process, right? So there was almost like the sense that they were going to have to do this continuously.
The amendment provision that we've actually used most, which is Congress adopts it and then 3/4 of the state legislatures ratify it, came in very late, and we were very lucky that it did, because all 27 amendments have been done that way.
Other questions? You, sir.
Bob Ritter from the American Humanist Association. Sort of on the flavor of original intent. The provision of the Constitution that talks about no religious test for public office, in your readings and preparation, did you get a concept of separation of church and state, or what would you say about the role of religion in government with respect to the national government?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not much was talked about at the convention about religion. That provision was largely uncontroversial. They fought a lot over how long you had to be in the country as an immigrant before you could be elected to the House or the Senate. But that one was not. And except for that provision, nothing else in the Constitution talks about religion. And the only other time it came up was when they were at each other's throats, and Ben Franklin proposed that they hire a minister to come in and give a benediction every morning, and that would help them reach agreement, which was odd because he was not a churchy guy. And Hamilton got up and said, well, we can't do that. Everybody will know we're fighting each other, and that'd be bad. And then some other guy got up and said, well, we don't have any money to pay a minister anyway. So, so they didn't do it, and that was it.
You, sir?
George Washington did personally edit the slave clause. He actually edited it, and it came into a final form. He also edited the little section dealing with slave trade will continue until 1808, near the end. Those were the 2 where he personally took interest in editing part of the Constitution. I filed a civil action over the election in 2000 that addressed the issue of the Electoral College. The Electoral College incorporates the Free Fields Clause. That's why a slave owner from Virginia, and it gave near a quarter of the presidential electors needed to select a president to which the state of Virginia alone. And that's why a slave owner from Virginia for the first 36 years was our president. And about 50 of the 60 years, those that had an interest in slavery were chief executives. But what I'm what was interesting, I didn't know at the time I filed the civil action over the Electoral College. The Congressional Research Service did a survey of all the civil actions that were filed over the 2000 election. And I highlight the civil action that I filed in behalf of the Executive Director of Douglas Institute of Government. Well, all the civil actions that were filed by all of the organizations, to single out the arguments that I was making. And I don't know whether I was proud of that. Actually, I'm fearful of that, because my own experience was as a pro se litigant, as a union organizer. But in essence, I'm holding a workshop. There's going to be presidential electors that's going to be challenging the next Electoral College. And the question is this, is how did it come about that there are states where you have winner take all? And many people don't seem to be aware there are about 23 states in which there is no winner take all statute. And yet they award candidates on a winner take all basis. How can that be maintained if the challenge is made from those presidential electors in a state where there's no state statute and no state law to challenge the winner take all?
Yeah. The Constitution itself, which is what I'm here to talk about, really only has two provisions about electors, that they can't hold federal office and they have to be picked by the state. The state determines how they'll be picked. That's it. And that's all the Constitution requires. I do know of 2 states that don't go winner take all. I don't know your other number. There's 23 who don't have a statute, and I don't know any sources that support your notion that Washington was editing those slavery clauses. I just have never seen that.
And if you go to the National Archives, I have the records where his personal notation. It is in the National Archives.
Well, he may have written it down from what somebody else was saying. I just would be very skeptical that he was doing that on his own.
I don't know that.
Okay. But, I do think what we have in the Electoral College was a very wide open delegation of responsibility to the states. And they can choose the electors however they wish. They can choose them statewide. They can allocate them. I think it's Nebraska and Maine. Yeah, that allocate them. We have an election law expert here. I should shut up. So I'll shut up.
No, there are those 2 states where they do it congressional district by congressional district, which would have quite a. If California, of course, there was a proposal to do it. They tried to get on the ballot to do it out there as well, which would have.
That was to reduce the Democratic take. Yeah.
Yes. Is there a question over there on the side?
Yeah, this is fascinating. My name's Elaine Middleman. I'm an attorney, and I had a case in the D.C. Court of Appeals about 20 years ago involving something called the Second Amendment, which possibly may be ruled on shortly. Anyway, Judge Nebaker, in that opinion, in a concurring opinion, cited something I'd never even heard of, that the District of Columbia is a, quote, seat of government. I just looked it up again. It's Clause 17. And that, therefore, it was not a state and the Second Amendment did not apply. And I have gotten, since that, several comments from different people. Some thought that was brilliant. Some people thought that was ridiculous. And as I said, I didn't know anything about it. And I just wonder if that's ever been really litigated. I don't know.
Well, it's a great question. You give me a chance to mention my current project, which is working on the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. And actually, one of the impeachment articles against him was that he had conspired with his supposed new Secretary of War, Lorenzo Thomas, to violate various laws. And one of the defenses they came up with was that the conspiracy statute only applied to states and not to the District of Columbia, which was the seat of government. And it is an issue that's come up. It's certainly on the representation issue. That's what I was reaching for. Just in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of argument over that, and
whether Congress could authorize
can authorize states because they're not a state. And the question is, Congress has plenary authority over the district. Is that enough to offset this other implied restriction, I guess I'd call it?
Members of the House of Representatives are from the states.
From the states.
Right.
And
we had an ACS panel on this, as I recall.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I'll stop there. As to,
Whether that clause, the significance of that clause.
The seat of government clause.
I think it's, boy, I guess I'd have to see a case. I sound like a candidate for the Supreme Court. I'm not sure that it clearly means something. Certainly there's plenary power of the Congress over it.
The purpose of it, I gather, was to prevent the Congress from sitting in somebody else's capital, basically.
They'd had this bad experience in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, where the Philadelphia troops attacked Congress. They hadn't been paid. They had a reason. And nobody came to defend them. So that was the historical reason. And just to be independent of any state. So there was a lot of concern that if you had the capital, it would just be good for you to make money on and to be more powerful. So that was a factor.
Other folks? Comments, questions? Looking back.
One of the legends of the Constitutional Convention is that they believed in secrecy, so they closed the windows. And it was a stifling hot summer, and people were getting sick. They were getting stifling. They were fleeing. There was many days in which only a handful were there. They were drinking a lot in Benjamin Franklin's tavern, and so on. I wonder if you could just confirm or deny that.
Well, much of what you say is true. It was hot. They did close the windows and lock the doors, which had to have made it really unpleasant. And they were pretty heavy clothes. I did not come upon any real evidence of delegates sickening. They seemed to be pretty healthy. A few were called away because relatives got sick. And they drank a lot. There was it was one of my favorite parts of the research. There was a lot of anxiety about the Philadelphia water in the summer. It was too cold. And people would drink it when they were overheated and would drop dead. This was in the local press. And to treat it, you had to take laudanum and alcohol, which would pretty much solve anything. And so I think they avoided the water. And so they had beer and port and Madeira and punch.
You have a vivid description in there of the gentlemen all drinking and drinking until they got sick and then starting over again at a dinner party.
It was a hard drinking group. So, they met from 10 until 3, and I think after 3 o'clock they were in the taverns.
Couldn't the Senate kind of influence over the election come, but they originally thought that they were just going to address the Articles of Confederation, and so that being over the original intent of the founding may have had some influence in having some provision that preserved. I think the Delaware provision, they were not supposed to do anything other than consider the Articles of Confederation. And then Roger Sherman's role in the Connecticut Compromise.
Okay.
That's a lot of material.
Yeah. It is true that many of the state assemblies authorized their delegates only to amend the Articles of Confederation, and that was not the intent of Madison and several of his co-conspirators. And I think most of the people who were in the know knew that. And I think the folks from Delaware just kind of got their minds right on the subject and stuck around because they figured the train, was going to happen anyway. So they might as well stay. It was the opposite of the Rhode Island response. The people from Delaware decided as long as we're here, we might as well get what we can. Roger Sherman is a tough guy to talk about too much. I actually didn't ever call it the Connecticut Compromise in my book because I thought it wasn't his. I actually felt that Franklin had first proposed it. And Sherman was useful for it, and I think he was an influential delegate. But he's one of those guys like Wilson and Rutledge who didn't leave much correspondence. And frankly, if it's not written down, it's very hard for historians to write about it. And the guys who left good records, like Madison and Washington, get better press. And I'm afraid that's what happened with Sherman. We call this last one.
Yeah, let's do the last one. We'll give one more question. Running, I guess.
Again, speaking speaking of Madison, you mentioned that Madison did not serve on any committees. Other than taking notes, how did he affect the Constitutional Convention?
He was on a committee at the end. He was not until the very end. He was on the committee that actually came up with the Electoral College, which there's a feather in your cap. And I think taking notes was a big job. He would go home at night and work on them. I don't think he was carousing in the taverns. It really wasn't his style. And actually, he played a pivotal role in, I don't mean this to sound demeaning, but they had a secretary of the convention who was not very good at his job. And he was supposed to be keeping track of everything, the amendments, which were written on little scraps of paper. When you go to the Library of Congress and you find the amendment that wrote the Supremacy Clause or whatever, it's on this scrap. And they'd sort of pass him up. And this guy, Colonel Jackson, that was his name, was not very good at keeping track of this stuff. And so after they were done for the day, Madison and Jackson would compare notes. And Madison would basically correct everything Jackson had wrong. And on the votes and all sorts of things. You know, in a day they could have 30 votes. So I think he was actually pretty busy with that stuff.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you, David, for telling us about
Thank you.
a book that many people will find an interest in reading, I'm sure.
Thanks.